Good morning, church, and welcome to the June 24th episode of the Musings. Last week, I spoke about some of the ways that God is different from us. And one of the ideas I put out there was that God never loses control. Now, to me, that implies that God doesn't experience anger, at least not in the way that human beings experience anger. For us, getting mad means being overwhelmed by an emotion, and I don't see how that's possible for God. But what do I do with all those passages of Scripture that refer to God's anger and God's wrath? Well, I don't have the answer for that question. I do have an answer, one that generally works for me, so here it is. Sometimes your young child might ask you a question that you can't answer, not because you don't know the answer, but because the child cannot comprehend the answer. So you give them a response that they can understand. You may tell them that you'll explain it when they're older, or you may simplify your terms even though that makes your explanation less precise. You may try an analogy even though it won't be perfectly accurate. You try to give them something they can work with, something that helps them. You do the best you can. Your difficulty is that you have to work within the capacity of the child. You have to use language the child can understand, logic the child can follow, references that the child can apply. Your communication is limited by the limitations of the child. Well, I think that's similar to what God faces in expressing His nature to humanity. We are severely limited. We can't comprehend who God is, what God is actually like. So He presents Himself in ways that make a relationship with us possible. For example, I just used the term Himself. God is not male in any regular sense of the word. God transcends all that, and yet He teaches us to think of Him as Father. Now, I'm convinced that's because conceiving of Him as a Father allows us to understand Him as best we can and respond to Him as appropriately as we can. It's an analogy that works even though it's inaccurate. So whenever I run up against some idea about God's nature that I just can't quite make sense of, I generally chalk it up to the inadequacy of my own human understanding. And the idea of an irate God is one of those ideas. It's something that I can't reconcile with my own experience of God's nature. And that's okay. Which I guess is the point that I really want to make here. There are things about God that I will never understand. Things that no one will ever understand. And those things are sometimes hard to reconcile. It has to be that way. After all, what use is a God that can be fully understood by a human being? That kind of God is way too small. God has to be incomprehensible or He's not God at all. We are not intended to know and understand all about God. There are things that we will get wrong, things that will confuse us, and I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with what I don't know about God because of what I do know about God. Because there are things, very important things, that He has made crystal clear. He exists. He loves us. He has redeemed us. His grace is sufficient for us. Our future is secure in Him. And in the end, I don't need to comprehend much more than that. God bless you all.